computer. Right. And whenever you would like to start, Noah.
All righty, cool. Welcome y'all to a virtual speaker night. Thanks for coming in. If you don't know who we are the Electronic Game Developers Society. We are a bunch of students here at UT with a passion for making games. And our mission is to grow all of our members' skills in making games and foster a very welcoming community. We only have about one upcoming event in the next few weeks, and that's going to be a Unity workshop coming up this next Monday, April 11th, in room GDC 4.304, where we will be learning how to program AI in Unity 3D. Some of the topics you're going to touch on that during that are going to be how to use decision trees, as well as different AI options for whatever you might need them for. Some ways that you can stay connected with EGaDS. Of course, follow us on all our social medias. Discord is where we blast out all of our event notifications. Same goes for Twitter. Itch if you want to see projects by our members, and YouTube for videos on talks and events like this. You can also join EGaDS. It's a $10 for your dues. You can pay us cash or Venmo. I don't believe our treasurer is here, but if you need to Venmo us, send it to Steph with your full name, EID, and t-shirt size in your Venmo payment. And you don't get exclusive access to the GDAD Career Fair that has already passed us by, but you do get this t-shirt. So if you want this t-shirt, pay us the money and it's all yours. If that one's not exactly your style, but you want this one from last year, we have a few left over. It's also $10. Just talk to one of us whenever you get a chance. Don't quite send the money over to us yet because we have some sizes, but not all sizes because of the fact that they're leftovers. So just talk to us and we can see if we can work something out. And of course, check out some of our related organizations, Longhorn Gaming and Women in Gaming. We do a lot of fun events with them and we really like to see what they do and they like to support us too. So definitely give them, check them out. And as always, a special thanks to the support that we get from our sponsors here, Zynga, Archetype Entertainment, Every, and Pocket Gems. We really appreciate all that they do to support us. And thank you for being here. Speaker nights can't happen without an audience, so we really appreciate y'all coming. Without further ado, Q&A with Austin WIntory, of course, the award-winning composer for games including Journey, the first and, at least to my knowledge, and to date only video game with a Grammy-nominated score, along with plenty of others, more than I could fit on bullet points here, but I chose Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Abzu, and The Pathless to show here as well. So without further ado, Austin.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As I mentioned, I have pre-prepared nothing. And so there's always a variety of ways that I can do discussions like this, and I always try to make sure that it's catered in one way or another to the interests of those on the receiving end. So obviously, if I'm talking to a group of composers who, like if they're students or they're early in their career or whatnot, then it very quickly devolves into kind of inside baseball sort of style shop talk. Whereas if it's folks that are interested more broadly in the game industry or even just media, I also work in film and TV and the world of the concert hall and that sort of thing. And so, there's 1,000 places even just under those headings that we can go. And so obviously I got a bit of a sense of what you guys do just now and from the early emails I have, but what would you say? Well, actually, let me phrase it this way. In what ways do you think I can be most useful to you? Because it's one thing to spout off about the awesomeness of video games or how lucky I feel to work in that field and to have so many friends who I cherish and that sort of thing. But that's one of those that it all certainly sounds nice and it's probably mildly fun maybe to listen to. Me yammer about that stuff, but it might not necessarily be particularly useful. And if I really got my wish, it would be that the next hour or however long is actually useful to you as you prepare for whatever is coming next. So for that, I definitely need your guidance. I need to know what's useful to you and what kind of questions you're facing and what ways that I can be of service. So however you want to structure it. I am at your command.
Yeah, so we recruited questions from some of our members, and I see Jojo just raised his hand. So we'll probably just take whatever questions our members have about whatever topic and throw them at you and just see where conversation goes. So
Love it.
Jojo, you raised your hand, so if you want to go ahead and start, if you have a question, go for it.
Yeah, I think a good place to start that like kind of relates to us and where we are in our like, dev journeys and stuff is just what you like talking about, like what did you study in school? How did it look like when you were in school? Like maybe different from how it is now, and like just that initial journey of getting your foot into the industry.
So I went to my university days were split between NYU in New York, and then I transferred midway to USC in LA. My goal was always initially to come to LA, just because my logic was if you're going fishing, you got to go where the fish swim, and LA was undoubtedly the hub for, at the time it was really principally thinking in terms of the film industry, because when I was first getting started and really thinking about these questions and asking myself, where and what am I going to do? That was 20 years ago. And at the time, most video game composing was principally handled through staff in-house positions. So you would have, an actual employee of the game company whose job was to write the music. And because I was also interested in writing film and, pursuing what other shenanigans were of interest to me, staff writing didn't seem really compatible with that. So I didn't actually think I had particular prospects as a composer for games, despite the fact that I was a super diehard, passionate gamer, and I was very familiar with a lot of game music and had heroes whose work inspired me in the world of games and all that kind of thing. But yeah, just it didn't seem like, unless I was prepared to kind of pursue an actual 9-to-5 job in the game industry, that would actually yield professional opportunities. So LA was, in other words, principally of interest because of its proximity to the film industry. And so after spending a couple of years at NYU, and I made my way out here, and that was not quite, that was, let me think, 17 years ago. And one of the things that I discovered upon moving was that there was a shift starting to happen right in front of me by dumb luck, away from the staff composer idea of in the game industry. And so I was just lucky that I kind of arrived at a time where freelance composing was starting to become much more normal. And now it's so far the other direction that staff jobs are actually very rare and novel. Composers that actually, like my buddy Darren, who does music for Supergiant games like Hades and Transistor and Bastion. He's a rare example of someone who actually has a 9-to-5 job working for the company and does not do freelance work on the side of it as a general rule. But he's very, very unusual as the modern sort of layout of the industry is. But all that said, I basically got really lucky. I came out to USC with the prospect of hopefully finding filmmakers and film scoring opportunities and whatever else I could drum up. And one of the first people I met happened to be a young student in game design who asked me to write music for his student game. And then when a fellow design student friend of his asked for a composer recommendation for his master's thesis project, this guy recommended me, put us in touch. And that thesis project was a little kind of browser flash game called Flow. And as soon as it came out, we got approached by Sony to see if we were interested in remaking it as a PS3 launch title. And so I spent the better part of my senior year moonlighting on this thing, working from like 11 p.m. to 4 a.m, scoring a PS3 game that literally came out, somewhere in the middle of the spring term of my senior year. And it was this unbelievably stupidly lucky break where by the time I graduated, I had a pretty well-known, it was still very niche and kind of esoteric by mainstream game sort of references, but it was still a Sony game. It was a game that launched with the PS3. It got a lot of attention despite how small and weird it was, and absolutely paved the way for my career. So that's one of those, I always in a way hesitate to tell that story, and I'm glossing over 2/3 of the story, but these are the kind of the bullet points. The reason I hesitate to tell it sometimes is it's completely and totally unreproducible. So it has no real major takeaways. The only way to kind of have a similar thing happen to you is to go back in time and be me. And obviously I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And so, but the big takeaway was that the whole thing funneled to one very specific moment where I made what appeared to be a very innocuous decision, but which turned out to be probably the single most impactful life choice I've ever made, which was I saw a guy sitting alone at a concert and he seemed out of place. So I went and sat next to him and struck up a conversation. And if I had not done that, I would not have met him. He turned out to be the student game developer who later would bring me on to do his little student games, and then would recommend me to Genova Chen, with whom I did Flow. And then subsequently we worked on Journey together. And basically everything about my career today is predicated on having done Journey. It came out exactly 10 years ago, and exploded and led to a whole bunch more opportunities. And so if I hadn't talked to that one guy and just been curious about this, I was at a choir concert at noon on like a Tuesday, and the place was empty other than this one guy who kind of, it turned out he was an ROTC student and was going to go literally serve in the Marines as soon as he graduated. And he looked the part. I always joke that he looked like G.I. Joe. I mean, he looked like a guy that you wouldn't expect to see at a choir concert at noon on campus. And I was just so curious about, who is this creature? I need to go interact with him. And literally that was the most important decision I think I've ever made in my life. And so to me, that's the takeaway from that is this was, I wasn't deliberately living this way. My curiosity got the better of me. But in hindsight, I realized an open mindset, living life with the not just lack of awareness, but full embrace of the idea that at any moment I might be making a seminally massive decision. I won't know it until 60 of the dominoes have fallen, but I will be able to trace them back to this moment. Now, if you kind of think too much about that, you might lose your mind. It's like if I buy this brand of carrots, what sort of person will I be? Like, you don't want to get too lost in the weeds on this. But it definitely is the case for me that, my life definitely traces back to that exact conversation. And that I always try to just evangelize for the true lesson there, that while my specific arc is not something that can be replicated by anybody, no matter what field we're talking about. I don't know if any of you are composers, for example, but no matter what you do, invariably we all have these moments where we meet the right person, or we apply to the right job, or we do something that kind of, it's like when you're looking at train tracks and they've got the turnstiles a quarter mile down the track that clicks from track A to track B, and now the train's going to funnel off that way. We don't know when we're hitting the switch that's moving that down the track, but we are doing that constantly with everything that we do. And if you just live your life in a maximally open way, you will sort of, if nothing else, maximize the chances of one of those actually really making a big difference. But you'll also just be doing things, you'll be interacting with the world in a way that really amplifies those possibilities. But that said, I always like to tell a story about a friend of mine, a composer named Jack Wall, who is most well known for the Mass Effect franchise, and he also did music on most of the Call of Duty Black Ops titles. I think he did all but one of them, and a bunch of other stuff. And Jack has told this story many times that I love. His version of the story I just told was when he got hired to do Call of Duty. It was a guy calling him who they had worked together 15 years earlier on a Barbie game in the 90s. It was called like Barbie Island Adventure or something, and it was like a children's PC like CD-ROM game that would be the kind of thing that comes with a, you know, like a Gateway computer or a Dell computer that you would buy at like Costco. Yeah, I mean, this was not glamorous work. But the guy who hired him, I don't know how he got that job, but obviously none of them were, you know, buying mansions off of this. This was very kind of meat and potatoes sort of gristmill level industry work, which is what a lot of work is. And he was all too happy to have a job as a composer, did the job. And the guy remembered how easy he was to work with, and they got along great. And they didn't really stay that in touch. It just left a really good impression. And literally like 15 years later, that guy found himself in a composer hiring position on Call of Duty Black Ops 2. And remembered how lovely Jack was to work with, and just called him and said, "Hey, we haven't talked in a long time, but would you be interested in working together on this game?" And Jack's literally done, you know, every Black Ops game since then, and these are massive titles. And it was always one of those where, you know, if Jack had looked at his Barbie game and been like, "This is not a real job, so I probably shouldn't. I don't need to care about this because I want to be the guy that scores Call of Duty." Well, he would never have been the guy that scored Call of Duty if he hadn't taken the Barbie game seriously. And I love the life lesson in that. You never know what seeds you're planting. It's exactly the same takeaway as what happened to me, just very different parameters and people involved. But it is quite comparable. So anyway, I feel, you know, as simple as the question was about where I went to school and what did I study, to me, that's like actually not that useful to you potentially, but these semi-tangents off of that might very well be. And I like coupling my story with Jack's story, because Jack's is not actually related to school at all. And I also particularly, I think it's very important to call out the fact that in my case, I got stupidly lucky that a student connection led to professional opportunities before I'd even graduated. But that's very unusual, and I got very, very lucky. And every day that goes by and I meet more people who, you know, are just finding their career take flight, and maybe they graduated 10 years earlier, it just makes me all the more grateful to realize how out of the norm my situation was, and how more normal Jack's actually is. His stories, you know, I often remind people, John Williams was in his mid-40s when he scored Star Wars. You know, it just bears reminding occasionally. So in any case, that's out of curiosity, because I realized I started to ask and then I kind of got sidetracked. But what is the general makeup? Is the trajectory of the group in general one of game design in some form or another? I gathered from your mention of what's upcoming for this group that it's in some form of game development. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that is. I would say currently, right now, the people here are pretty split between like programming, game design. Our club is a split between design, art, programming, audio. Those are kind of the four main pillars. So I would say this call is a pretty representative subset of those groups, who all are just interested in what goes into making a game and doing that for a career or a hobby at some point.
Yeah. Okay, great. I wanted to know, because like I said, my answers may drift one direction or another if I feel like I'm talking to a bunch of composers versus if I'm not. And truthfully, I actually kind of prefer talking to non-composers, because I always value finding ways to zoom out and look for more universal sort of takeaways or things that might be more universally valuable than just strictly to people who are kind of cut from my precise cloth. So in any case, all right, one question down. That wasn't the worst I've done in terms of how long it took me to slog my way through the answer, but it's not my best either. I'll see how more efficient I can be. What else is on your mind?
Anybody can ask one here, or if no, you want to pull up. I know we had some kind of pre-written responses or questions.
Yep. I can ask one of those if we need to, but
it.
I do want to give anyone.
Yeah,
here
we
a
want to give
chance.
anyone here the opportunity first before we pull from.
Yeah,
some
I
pre-written
always
ones.
likewise prefer that from the standpoint that I like when these feel conversational and less, like I'm at some lectern.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that's actually really been nice about everybody shifting this over to Zoom on account of the pandemic, is it actually kind of made it more personal in a funny way. So yeah, please, anybody jump in. Don't be shy.
Anybody got anything? I don't want
I
to.
think I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So in an interview I think you did with Polygon a couple years ago, you talked about composing apotheosis for Journey, and how it was very hard for you to determine how you wanted to like end the piece, and how you ended up finding that out was you ended up composing an ending so that you could present it as a
In
like in front of
concert.
a concert. And you said how that was a very different process from composing for games because you had a different mindset. And so somebody who doesn't have that much composing experience, I was just wondering how different it is for you to compose for a concert that is for a game, and if there's any overlap between those.
Well, the parameters are completely different. I mean, in the case of that specific piece, I was taking fragments of what I'd written from throughout Journey, knowing that I hadn't quite figured out the ending. And so then therefore I could just kind of write whatever I wanted for the ending and compress it down into a piece that was not even 10 minutes long. So it was like, so the question became, how do I just make a satisfying, I think it was maybe 8 minutes. How do I make a satisfying 8-minute experience? And that's incredibly different from, actually, let me clarify. How do I make a satisfying 8-minute experience where we're up on stage and we're basically just playing music for people in chairs back behind us? That's a very different thing from how do I build this kind of toolkit of interactive musical building blocks that go into a piece of software that someone can interact with at home, and they can put it down, they can pick it up, they can do it in one sitting, they can break it up over multiple sittings, and they're theoretically alone and sort of immersed in it, but maybe not. And just like all these things that you don't think about when putting together concert work. But above all, the full game, even as short as Journey is compared to a lot of other games, with maybe about an hour and a half to 2 hours of runtime on average, that's still considerably longer than a less than 10-minute concert work. And so how to make a satisfying ending that the player walks themselves into is a very different question from how do I make a piece that just feels like it ends naturally after, dancing around in front of you for 6-7 minutes. And so I just came to this conclusion, well, look, I'm starting very quiet and intimate, and let's just kind of give it a sort of a pyramid shape where we build up from nothing. It builds to kind of like total chaos and destruction, and then dissipates back into the ether. It felt very nicely symmetric, which is how I do a lot of concert works anyway. I've always sort of liked that. It's more interesting to me. It's more fun to write than the sort of cliche, though effective, build to some big grand finale like you think of Beethoven. Every single piece ending with ba 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 bum 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 bum. It's like people have tried that a bunch of times, and I doubt that I'm going to improve on that formula particularly. So what else is out there? And I often really love when a piece kind of, it's like it dissolves in front of you, and there's something very magical about doing that if you can do it right, and you can actually pull it off. And so that was just kind of where I ended up. But I didn't actually think that could remotely apply to the game, because the game was supposed to have this emotional impact, and it was supposed to be all these things that, that theoretically wouldn't do. And it was this incredibly lucky moment of clarity that it turned out it made everyone go, wow, how that made me feel is actually how I think we can achieve that. And I remember, I'll never forget getting that phone call from Genova saying, I think you somehow sort of found the secret that was in front of, it was like hiding in plain sight the whole time. And so we tried it, and it's like immediately it clearly worked. And yeah, but it was one of those, that's the only time ever I've been in a position where I was able to kind of workshop in the Broadway theater sense an in-progress score for an audience, and then use that information to actually finish the real thing. It's literally, most of the time that's not possible because you're under such strict confidentiality agreements that there's no chance in hell of being able to do a thing like that. But Journey was sort of anomalous because they had announced the game, and then the schedule got really extended. So we were in this weird sort of unusual zone where people knew about the game, but our deadline was still months and months away, whereas normally things would get announced and then be coming out pretty immediately after, which means that even if I did do a concert, I will have had to commit to the ending already because probably the game is finished now. So it was one of those, just the stars aligning in a very unusual way. Pretty much everything about Journey, that's a pretty accurate description of. I mean, it was just so ridiculous how much had to go right that just by dumb luck did, or not even by luck, by, blood, sweat, and tears. But that one was always, that'll forever be a true, just one shot. I'll very likely never have something like that happen again. I don't, did that answer what you were asking
yeah.
about there? Okay, good.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That Polygon video, by the way, blew my mind. I was in New York for Comic-Con doing a panel, actually, funny enough. So that was right before the pandemic. And I was in New York doing a panel with Comic-Con that was about this game I did called John Wick Hex. That was going to be me and the lead actor named Troy Baker and the game's designer named Mike Bithell. And then we had this idea to ask a friend of ours named Alana Pierce to moderate the panel. And so the four of us went on stage together and just talked about the game as part of the press, because the game was going to be coming out like a week later. And Polygon had emailed me at some point and said, hey, if you're ever in New York, we'd love to have you into this actual studio to film just like an interview or something. They were super casual about it. So I just kind of, during the middle of the day, ran downtown to kind of the Wall Street area of Manhattan where their office is, shot a quick interview. It seemed like, it was fun. They were nice to talk to. And it was like this cool, weird red room, but it was nothing particularly outlandish or long-winded. So I was blown away when I saw the video they made out of that little chat. It was like, I was like, this is the best. Normally I'm horrified. I don't like resharing the things I shoot because I feel like I come off horribly. Or they just look so boring, or they cut it in a way that makes it seem like I'm just meandering endlessly or something. It never feels like I remember how it felt in the moment. It always felt like, oh, that was a fun conversation. And then later it just seems so awful. But this one, they somehow made it seem better and more interesting than the conversation. They just cut the crap out of it. And then the best part was that panel that we then did that weekend ended up being if any of you are familiar, there's a podcast that the four of us do called Play, Watch, Listen, that after doing that panel, Alana called the rest of us and said, hey, we should just keep this going. You want to do a podcast once a month? And so we did like 2 of them, and then immediately the world shut down because of the pandemic. So we shifted it to once per week. And we were literally messaging not 10 minutes before I jumped on here to figure out when we were going to record, because our 100th episode of that podcast is almost upon us. So it was funny how that weekend, that video and the seedlings of that podcast that turned out to be, again, I guess apropos the first answer, that was a pretty consequential trip to New York, it turned out. Because that video from Polygon ended up getting a lot of traction. I got a lot of messages from people still to this day. People randomly will be like, hey, I just watched that video and I didn't know. A lot of them people reach out because of that one video still. So it's funny. You never know. You never know what will happen. What else you got?
I wanted to ask, kind of speaking of podcasts, I love the Game Maker's Notebook, which you host a few episodes of, and I'm just curious, how did you get involved with AIAS and Ted Price and that crew over there?
They just cold called me. I literally, I mean, I very lucky. I won a DICE award for Journey, and so they were, familiar with me. And I don't remember which came first because I've presented in the DICE awards a few times, and I can't remember if the first time I did it was before or after the podcast started. I think the podcast was before they, because I've done it a few times, but I'm pretty sure I had started doing the podcast before that. Either way, it's not a huge industry, and so you meet people, and also the woman that runs the AIA is a woman named Megan Scavio, who used to run GDC. So I've known her for years, and so yeah, I just one day they called me and said, we do this podcast where Ted interviews game developers and kind of like senior level executive types. And we thought it could be interesting to branch out to composers. But what we would like is to keep the peer-to-peer structure, because Ted won't know what to say to a composer necessarily, beyond generic interview questions, in the same way that I wouldn't necessarily know how to interview Neil Druckmann. But so they said, would you want to come on and do it? And basically, it's just always been one of those, until the pandemic, it was always, anyone who's in LA, we would just find a time and do it. And they would usually come over here and we would just record it in my place. Or if I knew someone was going to be passing through LA for some reason, meetings or, recording sessions or an award show, like the game awards, Jeff Keighley's thing happens here, or E3 or whatever. And invariably someone would be passing through town. So we'd set aside time to have them come by here at the studio, and we'd record an episode. And because the DICE people were all based here as well, or at GDC or at DICE itself. And it just became this thing. And then of course, once the pandemic hit, we sort of started doing them remote, which opened up a whole new crowd of potential people. And I've loved doing it. In fact, the funny thing is, I had this fantasy of my friend Troy, the actor. He's so good in this kind of role, and so I said, how about I interview him, and then that be the leaping off point for then him to be the actor guest host who interviews other actors, because he knows every one of them. And I couldn't quite puppeteer that into happening. So they called me the other day and they were like, I guess you're now our music and actor person, because I just recorded one a couple weeks ago that's going to come out soon with Maggie Roberts, who played Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil 8 Village, the like 9-foot tall woman. She actually is literally my height, and I'm 6'1". And so that was a lot of fun. And I'm like, you know what, screw it. If Troy's too busy for this, then I'll just start chasing that down, because especially I've been working on a musical where I've worked with a lot of really talented actors recently, as directing them in these recording sessions. And I was like, man, it would be really fun to jump onto a podcast with a bunch of these folks. So I may expand my repertoire, but for the moment I've been pretty much specializing in composers and occasionally like sound designer or audio director types. I have one coming out. In fact, I think the next episode being published is with Philip Erickson, who was the sound designer and audio director on It Takes Two. And we did one during DICE last month. So yeah, anyway, that was just one of those. I love talking shop with composer friends of mine. I love, sort of being one additional set of signal boost for their work. I find a lot of my colleagues very inspiring, and I really enjoy being an active participant in the community. There's been a few composers in history that have done this kind of thing. Andre Previn would occasionally do these things, or like host TV specials. There's a wonderful interview you can find on YouTube of Andre Previn, who is a noteworthy composer and conductor, interviewing John Williams. And I've always thought that was an interesting dynamic that's rare, because most of the time the people interviewing composers, they don't really know what they're talking about, and you can feel it. They ask either very, very ignorant questions, which is not their fault. I don't consider ignorance a pejorative, because how can we be held to account for things that we don't know? So I've always hated that that's like a smear. But it is nonetheless not as enjoyable as somebody who's not ignorant and can talk and can, but who can understand that the audience will be, and try to finesse the answers so that anyone could follow the conversation, but they also won't ask sort of painfully generic questions. It's just one of those things I've found myself finding time for. One of my all-time heroes who I have a painting of literally over my shoulder here, right there. Actually, wait, it's that the one on the right. What direction is my finger facing? Apparently, I can't do this backwards. It's incredibly confusing. That one, Leonard Bernstein, was very much, a composer and conductor, but also like a media figure who provided a platform to not only conduct living 20th century composers' works and commission them and all that sort of thing, but he had TV. He did a lot on TV and on the radio, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and I always thought that was very inspiring. As most composers tend to keep to themselves, and I'm happy to be somewhat of an anomaly in that department that loves to go out there. And in fact, for any of you who are not familiar, the last thing I'll say on this subject is I also have a YouTube channel that anyone is welcome to check out, in which I do a lot of these kinds of things as well. I put a lot of material on there about my own work and kind of behind the scenes content, but I've really kind of become obsessed with making it a place to do versions of these sorts of podcasts that don't really have a home on these other shows I'm involved with. So like, for example, I did one recently that was a 5-part series where I went to 10 different composer friends of mine and asked them the same 5 questions, so that basically I ended up with, effectively 50 snippets. So I could take, 10 composers answering question 1, that's the first video. Question 2, answered 10 ways, that's the second video, et cetera, et cetera. And it was so interesting. I had such a blast doing that. And that's the kind of thing that, I do more and more of all the time. And if that kind of stuff is at all of interest, then you may enjoy what you find there. So there you go. The TLDR version is They Called Me.
That was a great answer, so thank you. Does anybody have any? I'm happy to keep asking, but I see. 2 people, nice. Benjamin, I saw you raise your hand first, so you got it.
Hello. I'm as someone who's relatively interested in sound design and electronic composition, but considering getting more into writing for orchestra. Are there any resources or advice you'd give for someone who wants to get into more the technical aspects of that?
When it's funny how you say you're considering it, as if this is like some seminal decision, to dabble with or mess around with writing for orchestra. I promise it won't hurt you to try it. So my suggestion would be, first off, graduate past the considering question as soon as possible and just do it. Know in advance that the best piece of orchestral music ever written is not likely to come out of you on that first swing. And fully accept and delight in that fact. There is no pressure to do anything of any consequence. The goal is to learn and have fun. I can tell you straight up, the first pile of orchestral pieces that I wrote were, pretty explicitly derivative of other orchestral works because I didn't know what I was doing. And so it was like, okay, well, if I kind of reverse engineer existing music and sort of ask myself, how could I write a piece that I would think of, okay, here's a piece that's really, romantic and very stirring and moving and beautiful. I wonder how that's put together. So I'd listen and think, okay, well, it sounds like the violins are doing this and the cellos are doing that. And I don't know what that instrument is. And it's search, okay, that's an oboe. It looks like the oboe's doing that. And that's a piano and then I would just try similar gestures and be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. It seems like the piano playing like this with the cellos doing this is an interesting collision. But I was sort of actively guided by a piece that was inspiring to me. And then you start to learn, bags of tricks, and you learn musical vocabularies. And this is a time-honored tradition. Bach learned to write for orchestra by literally just putting up a piece of Vivaldi's music and then having blank paper and just literally writing it out, because the act of writing it made you realize, the viola's rising up to that scale degree while the violins come down creates an interesting effect that Vivaldi did there. And I've internalized that because I literally made my own hand do it. I'm verbatim copying someone else's work, but yet I'm learning the lessons of their inner workings. Now you don't have to do something, that sort of meticulous or tedious, but things like that to me are very instructive and very low stress and low pressure. You know, I know that a lot of people will buy a bunch of sample libraries and then go find, you know, a piece of music they like from Star Wars or whatever, and see how closely they can duplicate with their samples how the actual recording with a live orchestra sounds. Because not only are they building their chops in the sample library sense of things and just the technical aspects of how to program samples and how to mix and how to make things sound sort of realistically acoustic in the box and all that sort of thing, but they're also simultaneously learning the compositional elements of that John Williams piece. To me, it's very much the modern equivalent of the Bach thing. And you go on YouTube, you'll find people that are like, here's me doing the Star Wars opening credits using the following sample libraries. You know, there's a whole kind of culture of composers doing that sort of thing as a way to learn and as a way to demo new libraries as they come out. You know, like so and so will release a new brass, new French horn library, or whatever, and they'll say, okay, well, let's put it through its paces by doing some music that features those instruments pretty aggressively or whatever. And all of this might be more. This might all be several steps down the road from where you're at, because there's also very, very low cost, much more sort of like meat and potatoes versions of libraries that you can get that just have really basic sounds. You know, I started writing music with general MIDI, which is like hard, literally off the sound card, where you couldn't have more than 16 simultaneous channels, and so, I had to be very discerning. Like I can't have, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 4 French horns, 3 trumpets. I can't write proper orchestral music in that way, because I've barely made it halfway through the brass and I'm already out. I haven't touched any other instruments yet. So, I learned on pretty primitive software, but it was still incredibly informative. I would play around with things and experiment, and then if you find yourself starting to get actually more serious about it or more interested, there's absolutely nothing that will ever beat just handing music to an actual human being musician and seeing what they do with it. And so it's like, if you meet a violinist at a party, or you have a classmate, or you have a friend who plays literally any instrument, doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's a traditionally orchestral instrument or it's like guitar or saxophone or whatever. But if you just say, hey, I wrote a thing, can I hear what it sounds like? And in exchange, I'll buy you lunch or whatever. Like, the education from doing a thing like that is truly beyond anything that you will ever read in a textbook about orchestration. It's beyond anything that you will get from taking a class on it. There's just no equivalent, because you will very quickly realize just how human this art form is, which to me is absolutely the selling point of it. It's what I love. I don't think of orchestras as collections of instruments. I think of it as a body of people who are constrained by physical limitations of their human form. That's what guides how you write for that kind of ensemble. You realize, if I want to write really quick string lines, I have to picture how fast can their fingers literally move on the fingerboard. Does this note make them go and stretch in a weird way because they're crossing from the G string all the way to the E string with no warning? Once you start to realize this is a physical process, you think differently about how to write effectively for it, and you lean into what we call the sort of idiomatic tendencies, and how to really write in a way that feels natural, as if you can play that instrument and you wrote it from that vantage. Some composers really can play quite a few instruments, and that just makes them all the more able to do it. But I'm not one of those. I basically am a pianist and a conductor, and so I write for violin purely from just what I've learned from 25 years of writing for violin, and so much of that for me started when I was 14 years old, and I just made friends in the orchestra and said, hey, what happens if you play this? And it was terrible, and they were like, this is so obviously written by someone that's never written for violin before, because you would never do this. And like 1 out of 50 of those would be interesting because of how kind of outsider my head was. I wasn't thinking in terms of the inner workings of violin, so I would do stuff that's kind of weird and different, and they would think that's cool. But 49 out of 50 were unnecessarily awkward. And they were like, if you just change this one little thing, look how easily this comes under the finger now. And that, I can never evangelize enough for casual, just hang with a friend, throw some music in front of them, and just see what happens for 30 minutes and then go have a drink or whatever. It's just, there's just no substitute for that in my estimation. So that was a lot, but any subset of that can be those steps to getting you on that way. The key is to remember we have this veneration of the orchestra as this compositional tool. Like, you know, there's electronic composers, there's people that play in bands, maybe there's jazz musicians, and then there's the orchestral musician, as if they're this like Mount Olympus species of composer that are somehow above everybody else. And I've always found that to be complete bullshit, because it's no different. You know, if I have friends, I was talking to a friend of mine earlier today, a composer, she's a singer, and she's a composer who can absolutely handle herself with orchestra, but she's a real gear freak. I mean, her whole world is synthesizers, and she buys tons of, you know, analog gear and has a very analog signal path in her studio where things are passing through, you know, actual sort of pedals and preamps and you know, physical compressors, all these kinds of things. She doesn't use software as much as she uses hardware, because she's just an old soul when it comes to stuff. And she's a genius at it. She really knows her stuff and has invested untold tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in this equipment. And so I don't look at someone like her and go, yeah, that's cute. And that, but like the orchestra, takes real knowledge. I mean, she can do things, she can manipulate sound in this very raw way, in ways that, you know, I know my way around electronics, but she's just deeper down that path. And so she'll do things where I'll just go, I genuinely have no idea how you made that sound. So I think the reason I'm mentioning all this is because I think a lot of folks tiptoe their way into the realm of orchestral writing because there's this perception that somehow you need to really know a lot. And it's like, how dare you even dabble in it before you've kind of achieved some minimum level of qualification? And I just reject that soundly. There are a lot of composers who write orchestral music who are not comfortable with it, but they do it anyway. And there's also a lot of composers that write, you know, electronic music that clearly don't know what they're doing there either. And there's people who are fluent in both, and there's people who are fluent in neither, who have a whole other way of thinking. And all the pretensions should be shed, you know. And I'm not trying to project onto you anything or read your mind, but something about the way you phrased it made it sound like, you know, I'm inching my way towards feeling some self-worth that will let me tackle this beast, like I now deserve the honor that is writing orchestral music. And I'm hopefully making you see that that's a very silly thing to worry about, and just do it. You know, probably a lot more than you think.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful.
I'm thrilled to hear that.
Ethan, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, for sure. So my question is kind of on the subject of sort of with game soundtracks in general. So Journey was, I believe, the first game soundtrack to be nominated for a Grammy, right? And although that was kind of a while ago now, it kind of still has had me thinking of the kind of perception of music for games and stuff like that in the more so the mainstream and things like that. And with, I'd say, more like game soundtrack concerts and all that becoming more prevalent, I've seen conversation around whether kind of game music is as recognized as it should be. And I'd be kind of curious to hear what a composer's opinion on that sort of thing would be. Like if game music is as recognized as it should be, or if it's kind of good where it is, kind of like fitting in with that niche with people who are more into it and stuff like that.
So there's a few threads that can be pulled out there. First off, just with specific regard to the Grammys are voted on by the the Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, which is called NARAS. In the same way that the Motion Picture Academy votes on the Oscars and the Television Academy votes on the Emmys, the Recording Academy votes on the Grammys. Now, the Recording Academy, as you would guess from the name, is a record industry adjacent concept. So there's I think 86 categories at the Grammys. They were just on Sunday a few days ago, and you know they have the big main TV show where they show like 8 of the categories. You know, Song of the Year, Best New Artist, Album of the Year, those kinds of things. But there are a ton of additional, far more niche categories, and way more niche than video game music. You know, Best Tropical Latin Jazz Album, Best Liner Notes, Best Packaging, Best Surround Sound Mix, Best Historical Album, you know, Best Solo Classical Voice Performance. There are a lot of Grammy categories for things that have vanishingly smaller audiences than the world of video games. Now, the funny thing that's interesting there is, it's been since 1999 that video games were eligible for the Grammys, and it somehow took till 2012 before the craziness that happened with Journey, and it's still somehow only that one time that that's happened, but it's actually been literally, you know, 23 years that it's been eligible. For the first, you know, from 99 until about 2011, the category was called, they had 3 categories that were associated with so-called media music, which was Best Score Soundtrack Album, which is what Journey was, that's the category Journey finds itself in, which would be typically film and TV. And as you can imagine, that was almost always dominated by film. In fact, the way the Grammy voting window works is it sort of falls after the Oscars. And so predictably, if you look at what's typically nominated for the Grammy for soundtrack, it's almost always very similar to what just was nominated for the Oscars. Although because the windows overlap a little, occasionally there will also be a score that's like part of the upcoming Oscars. But that's usually how that's voted on. It's like what scores in the world of film are getting the most notoriety. There are occasional exceptions, like Game of Thrones managed to, I think, win a couple. Stranger Things, you know, made it through. The Queen's Gambit TV show is what won. It tied, actually, Soul, the Pixar film, and Queen's Gambit tied for that category just this past Sunday. So they used to be called Best Score Soundtrack for Film, TV, and Other Visual Media, which was basically code for video games. They then realized, you know, that's sort of marginalizing games to sort of like the kids' table at the wedding reception. So they changed the category just a year or two before Journey's nomination to Best Score Soundtrack for Visual Media. They put all of them on the same level. And to me, I liked that. Now, I keep seeing people say there should be a separate category for video games. And I think that that's absolute ridiculousness, because the Grammys are not evaluating scores. They're evaluating soundtrack albums as standalone experiences extracted from the thing for which they were written. In the same way that if you're nominated for Best Jazz, you know, like there's a category Best Improvised Jazz Solo. That's clearly like, that's not based on how did they play it in the studio or how did they play it live. It's what made its way onto the record. What's on the actual thing on Spotify or on CD or vinyl or whatever. In the same way, we sit down to score a game or score a film, and we have all these different things that measure how successfully we've done that. Like if the game is that much more exciting because of our score, blah, 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 blah. That is a completely separate thing from now I take that music, I pull it out of the game, and I find ways to rearrange it and hopefully structure it that it makes for an actually interesting, linear, passive experience. And a lot of games, for example, you know, especially like a big open world RPG, we were talking about Elden Ring at the beginning of this, like that's a game that has crap tons of really, really unintrusive kind of ambient music. Now imagine if the whole album was just this one-to-one replication of what it was like to actually wander around and play that game. You'd end up with this like 60-hour album that's mostly really, really, really uninteresting to listen to if that's all you're doing and you're not playing the game. So to me, the art, someday I'm gonna make a YouTube video about this, but the art of making a soundtrack album is knowing what to cut and how to shape it and say, oh, this piece of music is cool, but it's actually more interesting if I put it after this other piece, even though when you play the game, it comes before this other piece or whatever. So there's all these processes you go through. To me, that's what that category, the Grammys, is all about. It's about that decision-making process and what did it yield. Did you end up with a good album for a thing that was not designed to be an album? that to me is an interesting question. The other two categories are, of course, best song for a film, and also they have one that's basically like best compilation album, which would be this sort of classic, like Guardians of the Galaxy. We have all these famous 80s rock songs, and we made a cool record out of it that's kind of like a mixtape. And so like that category is honoring those albums that are taking existing things and making a fun or interesting combination thereof, which is a very interesting and kind of esoteric category to give out. So anyway, so all that said, it's an interesting question on how mainstream any of this is. Probably, I'm guessing a lot of what I've told you in the last 5 minutes is new information in terms of some of these Grammy categories and all that. And the other thing that I started to say that I kind of glossed over is the Grammys are voted on by members of the Recording Academy. Well, to be a member of the Recording Academy, you have to have commercially released music. This is not music fans. This is, not in the sense of like the consumer. They're music fans who probably that's what made them turn into professionals. So it's all people who have released albums, and you have to have some minimum number of credited album releases to your name. And they've actually made it harder to join in recent years. We also have to get letters of recommendation from people that are already in the Academy. And they limit how many letters you can write per year as an Academy member. So the result of which is that this is theoretically an informed body of voters. Now, even with that restriction, there's something like 10,000 people in the Recording Academy, because it's, there's a million genres of music in the world, and they're pretty much all under that umbrella. So you got jazz people, and you got, R&B people, and you got hip hop people, and you got rock people, and you got blues people, and you got obviously, composers working in film and TV and video games, and you got, like straight ahead pop people, and you've got classical music, there's all manner of classical producers and performers and things like that. And so it adds up pretty quickly. And so the sheer fact of the matter is that because video games haven't really been an active part of that landscape, there aren't that many composers in the Recording Academy who know much about video games compared to the number of composers that really just focus on film. I am one of, I could probably name off the top of my head every composer colleague of mine in games who I know for a fact is a member of the Recording Academy. It's because it's probably like 30 people. So even if they steadfastly vote for some new video game soundtrack that came out that blew them away, there's going to be 100 or 200 or 300 composers in the world of film that are going to vote for film scores that blow them away, because they're just more aware of it, because they're sort of isolated communities from one another. So it's not a reflection of how mainstream something is, how much the audience is aware of it. It is literally down to, of the people in this little club, how many of them actually know what's going on professionally in these circles that are different from the ones that they run in. In the same way that if I go to like the top hip hop producer in the world and I go, who would you vote for best improvised jazz solo in they wouldn't have a fucking clue who the nominees are. That's just completely off their radar. They could probably tell you everything about hip hop, but they would not know anything about the world of jazz, never mind that subdomain of jazz. And so, and this is why they break the Academy into chapters, where it's like, okay, I'm in the composer and producers chapter, and there's a performers chapter, and they're also broken into cities. And so the result is that a small number of people are choosing these nominations that are then voted on by the broader Academy later. The Oscars work the same way. Like the composer branch chooses the Oscar nominees, and the general Motion Picture Academy votes on who actually wins. So theoretically, the nominees are being chosen by, 20 people, 30 people who are there because they're supposed to be really informed, and they see all the movies and they know the composer's works, and they can speak from a professional vantage point. So all of that is my way of saying how all this stuff works has no bearing on if the audience is even aware. And this is why what the classic thing that happens is that because it's so insider, a movie will win Best Picture that 99% of the public has never seen, never will see, and probably never even heard of. And that's the same thing. I mean, look what happened with Jon Batiste winning like 10 Grammys on Sunday. That dude is wickedly talented. But if you look at how much like his album that he won all these Grammys for was streamed compared to like Adele's newest release or any number of other people. Like, this guy is beloved by the inner sanctum of people in the academy because he knows them, and he's very charismatic and clearly very talented, and he's won the respect of his peers. But the general public is like, I don't know, isn't that the guy that like they periodically cut to on Colbert? Like, because that's, if that, even then, how many people watch Colbert now? Like, so it's hard to say. So all of that said, your question about if video games are becoming more and more mainstream, I think games, the gaming public is clearly still smaller than the film going public or the TV watching public. You know, like 100 million plus people watched Squid Game on Netflix. Well, I don't know that you could name any video game except maybe a few like free to play mobile games and like League of Legends, which is also free to play, that have anything close to 100 million players of the one game. But collectively, all games have like billions of players. It's just that most people, like, you know, take a massive hit like The Last of Us. You know, if a game like that sells 10 million or 15 million units, they consider it to be a colossal success. But think about the size of the numbers of like 1 billion people will watch Avengers Endgame. You know, so your audience reach is an order of magnitude larger still on film, even though almost everyone in the world is a gamer of some kind or another. You know, especially with mobile games now, everyone's playing something. I mean, there's very few people that are truly, and that's the thing we always dreamt of. We always wanted to reach a place where it's not gamers versus non-gamers. It's just like, are you a movie buff that watches everything that comes out on Netflix and you're in the theater every Friday seeing every new release and you can tell me everything about all the Oscar nominees? Or are you somebody that like, you'll go see Spider-Man because your friends talked about it and everybody was going to be doing that on that Friday, but you're not like obsessed with movies? Or same with TV or what, like most gamers that's becoming how people game. It's not this, oh, I'm obsessed and I live my whole life for games, or I don't know anything about them. The industry is made better by a spectrum of engagement. The thing that's interesting is pound for pound within that spectrum of people, the average gamer pays more attention to the music than the average person watching a movie. So I'll release a video game I'll do a game that has modest success, say. Like I've done some independent games, for example, that like, you know, they sold maybe 500,000 copies. Well, that's still millions of dollars worth of revenue, and the company is, you know, happy and their game was a success financially, even if that audience seems small. 500,000 people is still a decent number of people. Well, a giant subset of that people will stream or buy or whatever the soundtrack album. And so if I compare that with, you know, a friend of mine that will do like a TV show, like I have friends that score very mainstream shows like CSI or something, but the number of people that pay attention to the CSI soundtrack will be a tiny fraction of the number of people that are paying attention to my game that was being played by overall a much smaller group of people, because the conversion rate is so much better in games. And I think part of it is just that you're reaching out and you're touching it. You're not just sitting on your couch and half paying attention. If I open up door number 1 versus door number 2 and I feel the music do something differently, I will find myself actively aware that has happened. And if I even remotely like that music, I'll probably go seek it out. It's kind of, I jokingly say it's kind of like a Stockholm syndrome where it's like you fall in love with your captor, you know, Beauty and the Beast kind of concept. That's sort of like this twisted idea that's like you've sort of been psychologically manipulated into loving something. It kind of, I jokingly say video game music is sort of guilty of that, because especially on these larger games where the player might play for dozens or many or more or hundreds of hours, you know, like a Red Dead or something, you know, it's like, how do you not emerge out of that just thinking that the music is the greatest thing ever? It's have you ever listened to your favorite album by your favorite band for 100 hours? It's just exceptionally rare, you know, even for me as a music lover. I don't know that there's very few things that I could think of that I've listened to as much as like the Mass Effect scores, because I've played the Mass Effect trilogy like 4 times start to finish. I've probably put 350 hours into that franchise. Like, so I don't know that I could name many things that I've heard as much as that collection of cues. So anyway, I think it's an interesting, I don't even know if this answers your question, but to me, it is an interesting, a bit of an apples and oranges to compare them, because video game music can be on paper less mainstream and yet more financially successful and more engaged with. And I mean, I put out an album 2 weeks ago, a sort of 10th anniversary of re-recording of Journey's original score. And about a month before that, I released a film score for a movie that I'd done. And like the number of streams on Spotify is like 100 to 1 of the two. And yet one is a 10-year-old video game and the other is a movie that was like actively in theaters and on Netflix but you know, people just don't seek out film scores except in these truly anomalous, you know, occasional and totally unpredictable circumstances. You know, like a Black Panther, that score by Ludwig Göransson achieved a kind of mainstream success as a record in a way that's very atypical. And it's freaking brilliant. It is well deserved, but that's, even other Marvel scores haven't had that. Even other Marvel scores for movies that made more money than Black Panther didn't even have that. I mean, it's interesting. Anyway, I could take maybe one or two more because I gotta get back to work because I'm leaving the country in like 72 hours and I got a lot to get done. Any other that I can jump on before it's sort of lightning round before I jump out of here?
Well, let me ask one from, this was one of the ones that we got beforehand, but it's one that I wanted to hear the answer to personally. And I should preface this by saying I'm not a composer, at least not mainly. I'm more of a programmer. But the question is, as someone who loves your work in Abzu and Journey, but has very little experience in music composition, I was wondering how you conceptualize so many instruments at once when you are composing a score.
Honestly, this is really not a different answer from the one before about learning to write for orchestral music, where it sounds like a cop-out to just say you just try it and fail and then start to get better at it. You know, to me, anybody that learns to specialize in anything starts to look really impressive to people that don't know anything about that thing. You know, I can watch, I can watch the crew operating a garbage truck navigate in and around tight corners, wheeling dumpsters out from tight alleys and flipping them up onto the back of a truck, and realize I don't know that I could just jump in and do that job. Like that, they are thinking across multiple axes and sort of internalizing the physics of what they're doing in a way that if you really actually pay attention, you're like, that's pretty damn impressive, actually. I wonder how you learn to do that without just making horrible messes all over the streets in front of people's houses and stuff. Like, to me, virtually every job seen at a professional level will look sort of mysterious and magical to an outsider. And yet, if you ask any professional who's doing that, they'll probably give this very mundane answer like, well, I don't know. I was bad at it and then I got good at it because I did it a bunch of times and I was shown by mentors or by just trial and error or whatever, the kind of how to get better at it, you know. And to me, writing for orchestra is not terribly different from any other musical ability, where, you know, I started on piano and I realized, oh, if I change the notes on this song I'm learning past some threshold, it doesn't really feel like I'm changing the song as much as I've kind of now entered into the domain of a new song. And so then it's like, I wonder how this would sound if then this thing I'm doing had a violin over it. And then it's like, suddenly now that actually makes sense. Well, what if that's two violins playing different music? And what if there's a bass plucking notes that are kind of like similar to what I'm playing in my left hand, and then very quickly you're like, okay, now I'm just writing for strings and piano, and that's itself not that exciting. It's just that's a thing I've done. I understand the mechanics of that. And then of course, as you study and you look at other works, you realize, oh, okay, there's certain things that work well. There's certain patterns people fall into. There's cliches that people use, sometimes with good reason because they're very effective, and sometimes because they just become trendy, and you start to learn about those sorts of things. And it's just this continuous aggregating process. So if I'm 20 years into that process and you listen to something I've just done, you think, oh my God, I don't know how I don't know how I could ever do a thing like that. And it's like, well, yeah, you couldn't, nor could I when I was sitting where you are, and in fact, I meet a lot of young composers where I go, you're already farther ahead at 19 or 20 or whatever than I was at 19 or 20. So, now I'm 37. When you reach that stage, maybe you'll be vastly more sophisticated or whatever in your approach than I am today. Don't compare yourself in a way that is actually very apples and oranges. It's tempting to fall into, it's tempting, oh, well, if I don't know how to do X, Y, Z, and this would apply to any field, but if you look at whoever your heroes are, and if you think, oh, well, I can't do what they do today, I may as well find something else to do with my life, you're forgetting whatever incredibly long and winding road that they probably had before they even made it to the thing that you know about, which itself was probably a long time ago, and they've grown a lot since then. So, it's easy to beat ourselves up over things that are simply unrealistic for us to have any grasp of or comprehension of, etc. So that's the best answer I can give to that. I learned the same way every composer I think in history has. I just tried things, and a lot of it was terrible, and the ones that weren't terrible were probably derivative, so they weren't original. So it doesn't even feel like I wrote music so much as pushed notes around that somebody else had come up with as a way to learn. And then eventually I start to learn things that feel more like, hey, this kind of feels like me. It starts to somehow feel like a thing I would do intuitively. And that's just a thing that emerges over time. When in the classical music world, if you look at the way that academics study the really, really kind of lionized composers of history, the Beethovens and Mozarts and Brahms and Stravinskys and Tchaikovskys and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that they often look to is when in their growth did they hit the so-called maturity? Because there's this recognition that so many composers, started writing music early on, and if you listen to their early works, you go, oh, there's nothing that remarkable about it, even amongst these absolute towering pillars of the world of orchestral or otherwise so-called classical music. Most of them, it took a bit of time, even for the most outrageously talented among them, before their music sounded like them. And that was one of those things that I realized with great relief when I was a student, that all those people were also in fact students and wrote like very much student music. Even the real genius, like the Mozarts, who, even as a teenager, he was writing pretty sophisticated works, but even he, there's a difference in maturity level as he became a real adult. That is when all the music that we care about, when we play actual Mozart music, they don't really play that early stuff of his nearly as often as they play, his later works. And that holds true for most every composer of note. There's occasional exceptions, but they're very, very rare. So that's always, a thing to bear in mind. Sorry, I got to run. I hope this was fun. We kind of covered a really wide gamut of stuff here. I feel like I didn't expect to spend 10 minutes explaining how the Recording Academy works, but hopefully it was interesting. Anyone can feel free to stay in touch. I'm on social media. Just look up my name, you'll find me on mostly Twitter and Instagram. I don't really use Facebook anymore. But thanks for inviting me to do this, and be in touch, and hopefully some or all of you find your way into the game industry. It's awesome. I love the game industry. If you read on Twitter, you would think that the game industry is a horrible hellscape, but I think it's an incredible industry, and I feel very grateful to be part of it. And it's full of some of the most absolutely mind-blowingly creative people that I could ever imagine meeting, and I absolutely just relish it every day. And so for those of you that are potentially on that path, consider my vote of confidence in that decision. I hope to see you at a future, GDC or PAX or something along those lines. And if and when that happens, come up and say, hey, I was on that Zoom call. Here's the question we didn't have time for or whatever. But with that said, I got to get back to work. So have a good night all, and hopefully see you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. It was great to hear your wisdom and just taking the time out of your day to be with us. So really appreciate it.
Absolute, my pleasure. Take care.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks y'all for coming. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.